1923, Stephen Langdon published a translation of a damaged prism fragment excavated from Lhasa 2 years earlier. The object, now catalogued as Weld Blundell 62 in the Ashmolean Museum, contained what appeared to be a continuous list of rulers extending back before any known historical period. The text was formulaic, following strict scribal convention. Each king's name, his city, and the length of his reign. But the opening lines presented something unexpected. Before the first king's name appeared, before the first city was listed, the text included a single statement in Sumerian, Nam lugal anta edde abba, when kingship was lowered from heaven. Not established, not seized, not invented, lowered. The verb ed, to descend or to be brought down, appears throughout Mesopotamian administrative and ritual texts to describe the transfer of objects from one custodian to another, from one location to another, always implying prior possession elsewhere. The scribe who composed this list, working sometime in the early 2nd millennium BCE, copying from older sources now lost, did not describe the origin of kingship. He described its arrival. The text continues immediately into the first dynasty, as if no explanation were needed. Kish is named. Rulers are listed, reign lengths are recorded, but the question the opening line raises is never answered. If kingship descended, where had it been before? The Weld Blundell prism was not alone. Other fragments, some earlier, some later, use identical or nearly identical phrasing. This was not poetic language, it was bureaucratic. The terminology of transfer, of custody, of something relocating from one domain into another. Sumerian kings did not claim to have created the institution of kingship. They claimed to have received it. Royal inscriptions from the 3rd dynasty of carved in stone and pressed into clay, repeat the formula. Namu, founder of the dynasty, describes his reign as a restoration of order that had existed before and had been interrupted. His son, Shulgi, in over 200 surviving inscriptions, never describes his authority as new. He describes it as inherited, entrusted, passed down. Even the word for king, lugal, literally big man, implies a role within an existing system, not the invention of a new one. The institution precedes the individual. Late Babylonian copies of the Sumerian King List extend the pattern. They include kings who ruled for implausible lengths of time, 28,000 years, 36,000 years. But the scribes did not treat these figures as symbolic. They copied them with the same care they applied to historically verifiable reigns. The numbers were preserved because they were part of the record, and the record was what mattered. These were not myths being compiled. These were administrative documents tracking institutional continuity. What remains difficult to reconcile is the absence of a founding narrative. Other ancient cultures describe the establishment of kingship as a dramatic event. A hero wins a battle, a god intervenes, a city is founded, a law is proclaimed. But the Sumerian texts describe kingship as something already in motion when the record begins. The institution does not emerge, it arrives. The distinction is subtle but consistent. In the instructions of Shuruppak, one of the earliest surviving works of Sumerian wisdom literature, the speaker addresses his son not as the originator of knowledge, but as its transmitter. The advice given is described as old. The text opens, "In those days, in those far, remote days." Not, "I have discovered," or "I now establish," but "in those days." The knowledge is already ancient when the text is composed. This frame, this sense of receiving rather than originating, extends across genres. Legal codes are introduced as restorations of justice that had lapsed. Temples are rebuilt on sacred ground, identified as sacred before the rebuilding. Rituals are performed as they were performed before. Even the word for truth in Sumerian, nigzi, carries connotations of the original thing, the right way it was. To act correctly was to act in accordance with a pattern that preceded you. Kingship, in this framework, was not a human invention. It was a structure transferred into human custody. The King List does not say from whom or from where, only that it descended. The language is careful. The language is consistent. The language does not explain. In later periods, after the fall of Ur-3, scribes continued to copy the King List. New dynasties were added, but the opening line remained unchanged. Each generation of scribes transmitted the same formula. Kingship was lowered from heaven. Even when kingship fractured, when rival cities claimed authority simultaneously, when the political reality contradicted the list's linear structure, the text was preserved as written. The continuity of the record mattered more than its correspondence to contemporary facts. This suggests something about how the scribes understood their task. They were not chronicling political innovation. They were maintaining institutional memory. The list was not history in the modern sense. It was custody of a claim. The claim was this: what we govern, we did not invent. What continues here continued before. We hold what was given.
And if kingship was given, if it descended, then somewhere in the record, in some text not yet translated, some tablet not yet excavated, some archive still beneath the sand, there should be some account of what it was before it was lowered. But that account has not been found. The King List begins with the transfer. It does not describe what preceded the transfer. The institution arrives in the record already functioning, already legitimate, already ancient. The question the text opens with is never answered. It is simply recorded, copied, and transmitted, century after century, as if the answer were assumed, or as if the question itself were the point. What does it mean for an institution to arrive rather than begin? Tablet W 20044-47. Excavated from the Iana district of Uruk in 1959 and published in partial translation in 1987, is an archaic accounting document dating to the late Uruk period, approximately 3200 BCE. It is one of several thousand proto-cuneiform tablets recovered from Uruk IV and III strata, among the oldest known examples of writing anywhere in the world. The tablet records quantities of barley using numerical notation and pictographic signs. The signs are clear: containers, grain, symbols for storage. The quantities are listed in columns. The system is already operational, but there is no explanatory text, no legend clarifying what the signs mean, no instructions for how to read the notation. The scribe who impressed these marks into clay did not include a guide, because none was needed. The system was already understood. This pattern repeats across the earliest tablets recovered from Uruk. Thousands of documents, fragments and complete tablets record transactions, inventories, rations and allotments using a fully developed sign system and a sophisticated numerical framework. The signs distinguish between different types of goods, different kinds of transactions, different administrative categories. Some signs represent objects, some represent actions, some represent entities or roles. The system is not primitive, it is not experimental, it is complex, standardized, and already in use across multiple scribal hands. What is absent from these earliest tablets is any indication that the system is new. There are no practice texts showing scribes learning to write, no progressive simplification or clarification of signs over time in these earliest layers. The signs appear, and they are immediately employed in administrative record-keeping. The clay itself does not claim to be the beginning. Excavations at Uruk in the 1920s and 1930s exposed architectural levels beneath the tablets. Monumental buildings, temples, storage facilities, the urban infrastructure that required record-keeping was already in place, but the records appear suddenly in the archaeological sequence, not gradually. Earlier strata contain tokens, small clay objects used for accounting, but the leap from token to tablet, from object to sign, is not documented in stages. The tablets appear as a system, not as an invention unfolding. Other early urban centers present similar patterns. At Jemdet Nasser, at Ur, at Shurapak, Early tablets follow the same conventions established at Uruk. The sign forms vary slightly, but the organizational logic is consistent. This suggests either rapid transmission of a complete system or the activation of a framework that already existed in some other form. Neither explanation is recorded in the tablets themselves. The texts do not say, "This is how we have begun to write." They simply write. The numerical systems embedded in these tablets reflect a level of abstraction that appears without precedent. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal system for some counts and a bisexagesimal system for others, switching between base 60 and base 10 depending on what was being counted. Different sign shapes represented different magnitudes, and the same sign could represent different values depending on context. This was not a simple tally system. It was a sophisticated mathematical grammar capable of recording complex transactions involving multiple goods, multiple parties, and multiple operations. And it appears in the earliest tablets already functioning. Denise Schmant-Besserat's work in the 1970s and 1980s traced the use of clay tokens in the Near East back to the 8th millennium BCE. These tokens, small geometric shapes representing specific quantities of specific goods, were used for accounting long before writing. But the transition from token to script is not simply a matter of pressing a token into clay to create a sign. The tokens were three-dimensional objects. The signs on tablets are two-dimensional symbols. The leap involves abstraction, the idea that a mark can stand for a thing, that a sign can function independently of the object it represents. This cognitive shift is profound, but in the archaeological record, it appears to happen suddenly. One stratum contains tokens, the next contains tablets. The intermediate stages, if they existed, are not preserved or have not been found. The earliest tablets are not tentative, they are confident. The signs are standardized across multiple documents. The numerical notation is consistent. The tablets are organized into archives, stored systematically, and treated as authoritative records. The administrative apparatus that writing serves is already operational. The scribes are not experimenting with how to keep records, they are keeping records. What the tablets lack is self-reference. They do not describe their own creation. They do not include colophons explaining the origin of the writing system. Later tablets, from the early dynastic and Akkadian periods, sometimes include colophons crediting the scribe, the king, or the god who authorized the text. But the earliest tablets contain no such attribution. They record transactions, not the origins of record-keeping. This absence is consistent with the broader Sumerian pattern. Systems appear already in use, without narratives of their invention. Writing is treated as a tool, not a discovery. The tool is employed, but its origin is not documented. By the early dynastic period, around 2900 to 2350 BCE, Sumerian cuneiform had evolved into a script capable of representing spoken language with precision. Phonetic complements, grammatical markers, and syntax were encoded. Literature, legal codes, and letters were composed. But even these later texts do not describe the invention of writing. The instructions of Shuruppak, the Kesh temple hymn, the early myths, none of them narrate the origin of script. Writing is used to transmit knowledge, but the transmission does not include an account of how writing itself began. The Sumerian term for writing, sar, means to inscribe, but also to write down what is. It implies recording, not creating. The scribe's task was to preserve, to copy accurately, to maintain the integrity of the record. Innovation was not celebrated, accuracy was. The scribal schools that trained young scribes, the eduba, or tablet house, emphasized repetition, memorization, and exact replication of exemplars. The goal was not to invent new signs or new methods, but to transmit the system without alteration. The earliest writing, then, does not claim to be the origin of writing, it claims to be a record. The distinction is subtle but fundamental. If writing were understood as an invention, we might expect texts celebrating the inventor, commemorating the first tablet, marking the moment when knowledge became visible. But no such texts exist. Writing is treated as a practice already established, a system inherited, a method already known. The clay does not claim invention, it claims custody. The marks pressed into the surface say, "This is what was received, this is what is stored, this is what is owed, this is what remains." The system tracks continuity, not origin. And the continuity stretches back beyond the earliest tablets we have found, because the system those tablets employ is already complete. Somewhere earlier, in some form now lost or not yet recognized, the framework must have existed. But the tablets do not point backward to that earlier form. They point forward into centuries of record-keeping, into the long archive of what was preserved. The question remains suspended in the archaeological strata, beneath the tablets, where the tokens stop and the signs begin. What made the sign possible? And why does the record act as if the answer were already known? At the site of Shurupak, modern Tel Farah, excavations between 1902 and 1903 by a German expedition led by Robert Koldewey uncovered a distinct stratigraphic marker, approximately 3 meters below the early dynastic III occupation levels. The layer was composed of water-laid sediment, clean silt and clay, sterile of artifacts, averaging between 20 and 60 centimeters thick, depending on the trench. Beneath it, houses. Above it, houses. Between them, the flood layer. The architecture below was different from the architecture above, slightly different construction methods, slightly different ceramic styles, but both were recognizably part of the same urban tradition. The flood had interrupted occupation, but had not erased the settlement. People returned. They rebuilt on the same site, following the same spatial logic. This was not unique to Shurupak. At Leonard Woolley's excavations in the late 1920s uncovered a similar deposit. A layer of water-laid silt between occupation strata, thick enough to mark a significant event, clean enough to indicate standing water for an extended period. Woolley famously interpreted this as evidence of the biblical flood. But later analysis suggested the layer corresponded to a localized event, not a regional cataclysm. Other sites, Kish, Uruk, Lagash, showed flood deposits in some areas but not others, and the deposits were not contemporaneous. The rivers of southern Mesopotamia shifted course, broke through levees, inundated fields and cities episodically. Flooding was catastrophic but not singular. Yet in the textual record, the flood is treated differently. The Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian flood story, and the later Epic of Gilgamesh all include flood narratives, and in each, the flood is a caesura, a division between what came before and what came after. The Sumerian King List inserts the flood as a break in the sequence of dynasties. Before the flood, kings ruled for improbable lengths of time, from cities that may or may not be historically attested. After the flood, kingship was lowered again, and the cities and dynasties become recognizable, their rulers' names matching other records. The flood functions textually as a reset point, a boundary across which continuity is interrupted but not severed. The language is precise. The King List does not say kingship was invented after the flood. It says it was lowered again. The institution continues. The cities continue. The archive continues. But something has been lost in the interval, and what comes after is a restoration, not a new beginning. This framing, collapse as interruption, recovery as restoration, appears repeatedly in Sumerian historical consciousness. The flood is not the only such marker. The King List includes other breaks, periods when the kingship was taken to another city, when dynasties ended, when order lapsed. Each time the narrative resumes with the same formula. Kingship is restored, lowered again, passed to the next custodian. The institution persists, but its continuity is fragile, subject to disruption. The archaeological record supports the idea of recurring collapse. The Jemdet Nazar period, around 3100 to 2900 BCE, ends with evidence of destruction and abandonment at multiple sites. The early dynastic I period begins afterward, with shifted settlement patterns and changes in material culture. The transition is marked but not absolute. Pottery styles evolve, but they evolve from earlier forms. Architecture changes, but it changes within the same urban framework. Writing continues, using the same basic system. The collapse is real, but it is not total. What resumes is recognizably continuous with what was interrupted. The Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest flood narratives, includes a detail absent from later versions. After the flood, after the waters recede, the gods redistribute kingship and divine authority, but they do so by re-establishing the cities that existed before. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. The cities listed before the flood are restored after the flood. The text treats the flood as a catastrophic interruption of a prior order, not the starting point of a new one. The cities are not founded after the flood, they are refounded. Later Sumerian texts reflect a historical consciousness shaped by this pattern. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur, composed after the fall of the third dynasty of Ur around 2004 BCE, describes the collapse of the city not as an ending, but as a break in continuity. The temples are destroyed, the kings are gone, the rituals have ceased. But the text's purpose is not to commemorate finality, it is to call for restoration. The lamentation is structured as a plea to the gods to return, to restore what was, to re-establish the order that existed before. Collapse is imagined as forgetting, and recovery is imagined as remembering. The concept of historical time in these texts is not linear in the modern sense. Events do not progress toward novelty. They cycle between order and disorder, presence and absence, memory and forgetting. What exists now existed before. What was lost can be recovered. What is built now was built before on the same ground. The flood narratives, read in this framework, are not origin stories. They are survival stories. They describe how knowledge and continuity persisted across catastrophe. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim preserves life by building the ark according to precise instructions given by the god Ea. He brings aboard not only living creatures, but also craftsmen, the skills necessary to rebuild. The survival is not accidental, it is planned. It is a preservation of order through disaster. The flood is not the beginning of civilization, it is the test of whether civilization can continue. The archaeological flood layers at Shuruppak and Ur are thin. They represent weeks or months of inundation, not years. The sediment is sterile, but it is not deep. The destruction was significant, but not absolute. Some structures survived, some archives survived. When occupation resumed, the people who returned knew what had been there before. They rebuilt temples on the same foundations. They re-established administrative systems using the same methods. They did not start over, they resumed. This continuity across disruption is what the texts emphasize. The Sumerian scribes who composed and copied the flood narratives centuries and millennia after any historical flood event were not recording geology. They were recording a conceptual framework, the idea that civilization is vulnerable, that order can collapse, but that the knowledge of how to restore it persists. The knowledge is older than any individual city, older than any single dynasty. It survives in the memory of how things were done, in the records of what was built, in the texts that were copied and transmitted. The flood in this reading is a narrative device for explaining why the past is fragmentary. It provides a reason for gaps in the record, for the absence of certain texts, for the differences between what came before and what came after. It allows the Sumerian scribes to acknowledge discontinuity without abandoning the claim to continuity. The order was interrupted, but it was not invented afterward. It was restored. What remains unresolved is the nature of what was lost. The King List places the flood between the implausibly long reigns of antediluvian kings and the shorter, more credible reigns of historical rulers. The narrative suggests that something about the earlier period was different, more distant, less accessible, harder to verify. But the difference is not absolute. The antediluvian cities are real places. Some of the antediluvian kings appear in other contexts, treated as legitimate predecessors. The flood marks a change in the quality of memory, not the beginning of memory. Before the flood, kingship existed. After the flood, kingship existed. What changed was how much could still be remembered about what came before. The further back the scribes looked, the thinner the record became, until finally the record dissolved into time spans that could not be verified, reigns that stretched beyond human lifetimes, cities whose locations were uncertain. The flood provided a narrative explanation for that dissolution. It was not that the earlier period never existed, it was that the evidence had been washed away. But the institution, the knowledge, had been preserved and passed down. The question the flood narratives leave open is this: if the flood was an interruption, what was it that continued across the interruption? What knowledge, what structure, what memory was strong enough to survive the water and the silt and the abandonment, strong enough to re-establish itself afterward in the same cities, following the same patterns, claiming the same legitimacy? The texts say kingship was lowered again. They do not say it was reinvented. The clay beneath the flood layer holds houses. The clay above the flood layer holds houses. Between them, water stood for a season. And then the water receded, and the record resumes. But what is it that the record remembers? The Sumerian language uses a verbal prefix jiri, pronounced approximately nji, to indicate a specific aspect of action, the re-establishment or restoration of a prior state. It appears in administrative documents, royal inscriptions, and literary compositions, often translated into English as return, restore, or put back. But the prefix does not simply mean to bring something back. It means to bring something back to where it belonged, to re-establish an order that existed before. The verb jar means to place or to establish. The verb jar means to replace, to restore to its original position. The distinction is grammatically encoded. The language differentiates between creating something new and restoring something old. This distinction appears throughout Sumerian inscriptions. Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, describes his reign using the phrase Nig-si-sa, Ji-jar, to restore justice to its rightful place. The term Nig-si-sa, often translated as justice or equity, literally means making things right or putting things in order. But Ur-Nammu does not claim to have invented justice, he claims to have restored it. The language assumes justice existed before, lapsed during a period of disorder, and was re-established under his authority. The implication is that the order he enforces is not his own invention, it is a recovery of what should have been. The same construction appears in temple-building inscriptions. Kings describe their construction projects not as innovations, but as restorations. Temples are said to be rebuilt on their original foundations, following earlier plans, according to ancient measurements. The Sumerian phrase ki-tush, meaning dwelling place or foundation platform, is often paired with ji-jar. The foundation is re-established, the dwelling is restored. Even when a building is entirely new, the language frames it as a return to a prior state. The temple stands where it stood before. The god's house is rebuilt on the ground where the god's house has always been. In the Kesh temple hymn, one of the earliest Sumerian literary compositions, the construction of the temple at Kesh is described using language of emergence and placement, but the tone is not one of novelty. The temple is called ancient, Sumun, even in a text celebrating its construction. The structure is treated as if it has always existed, even though the hymn describes its physical building. The paradox is embedded in the language. The temple is both newly built and ancient. It is built in time, but it occupies a space outside time, a place that was sacred before the building stood there. This linguistic pattern extends to legal and ethical language. The laws of Ur-Nammu, the laws of Lipit Ishtar, and later the Code of Hammurabi, all present legal rulings as restorations of order, not as legislative innovation. The Sumerian term di means judgment or legal decision, but it also means truth or what is correct. To render judgment is to declare what is correct according to an existing standard. The judge does not create law. The judge discerns law applies it, restores it where it has been violated. Hammurabi's prologue claims that the gods appointed him to make justice appear in the land, to destroy the evil and the wicked, that the strong might not oppress the weak. The language is restorative. Justice exists. Hammurabi's task is to make it visible, to enforce what should already be, to remove what distorts it. The term kitam, Akkadian for truth or justice, is etymologically related to kinum, to be firm, to be reliable, to be in the right place. Truth is not invented. Truth is what remains stable, what endures, what was correct before and remains correct now. Sumerian historical inscriptions reflect the same temporal orientation. When kings describe military victories, they do not claim to have conquered new territory. They claim to have restored boundaries that were violated, recovered cities that were taken, re-established order that was disrupted. The phrase ene jar, to restore what was displaced, appears in royal annals describing the aftermath of conflict. The king does not expand the realm. The king returns the realm to its rightful extent. Even the Sumerian term for year, mu, carries connotations of naming and establishing, but year names in administrative documents often commemorate restorations. The year the temple of Inanna was restored. The year justice was established in the land. The year is marked by an act of recovery, not by progress towards something unprecedented. This orientation is not merely rhetorical. It reflects a worldview in which the ideal state is not something to be achieved in the future, but something that existed in the past and must be continually recovered. Decline is natural, disorder encroaches. Temples fall into disrepair, justice lapses, boundaries are violated. The role of the king, the judge, the priest, the scribe, is to push back against this entropy, to restore what has been lost, to remember what has been forgotten, to rebuild what has collapsed. Innovation in this framework is not a virtue, fidelity is. To depart from the old way is to risk losing the pattern. To preserve the old way is to maintain access to the knowledge that makes order possible. The scribal schools taught this principle through repetition. Students copied the same texts their teachers had copied, which their teachers' teachers had copied. The goal was not originality. The goal was accurate transmission. To copy a text correctly was to preserve a link in the chain of memory extending back to the origin of the text, whenever and wherever that was. Creativity was constrained by the need for continuity. Even in literature, this principle applies. The Sumerian King List attributes wisdom to ancient sages called the Abgal, who lived before the flood. The Abgal are described as advisors to kings, transmitters of divine knowledge, preservers of the arts of civilization. They are not innovators. They are teachers, intermediaries, custodians. They know because they were taught. The knowledge is passed down. Later Babylonian texts expand on this. The catalogue of texts and authors lists works attributed to the antediluvian sages, treating them as sources of inherited knowledge. The texts themselves are restorations, copies of older works, attempts to recover what the sages knew. The scholar's task is not to discover new knowledge, but to recover old knowledge, to restore the completeness of the archive that existed before the flood, before the collapse, before the forgetting began. This linguistic structure, this grammar of restoration, implies a very specific relationship to the past. The past is not simply what came before. The past is the repository of correctness, the standard against which the present is measured. To act rightly is to act as it was done before. To build correctly is to build as it was built before. To judge justly is to judge as judgment was rendered before. The model is not innovation, the model is return. But return to what exactly? The texts do not specify an absolute origin. They gesture toward earlier periods, earlier kings, earlier sages, earlier temples. But each earlier reference points to something earlier still. The chain of transmission extends backward, beyond the reach of the record. The scribes know they are copying texts older than themselves, but they do not claim to possess the originals. They possess copies. The originals exist somewhere further back, in the archive of memory, in the time before the most recent collapse, in the time before the flood, in the time when kingship first descended. The language of remembering, then, is also the language of incompleteness. To restore is to acknowledge that something was lost. To remember is to admit that forgetting occurred. The Sumerian scribes, in using these verbal forms, in embedding these grammatical structures into their inscriptions and their literature, were not claiming to possess complete knowledge. They were claiming to be custodians of partial knowledge, inheritors of fragments, preservers of what could still be remembered. The question embedded in the language itself is whether the chain of transmission is unbroken, or whether somewhere in the past, at some unrecorded moment, the knowledge was interrupted, the memory was fractured, and what was restored afterward was not the whole of what had been, but only what could be recovered from the ruins. The grammar allows both possibilities. It insists only that what is being done now was done before. Whether before extends in an unbroken line to the origin, or whether before means only before the last collapse, the language does not say. It only says, this is the way it was, and so this is the way it is again. Tablet BM 78161, held in the British Museum, is a foundation deposit from the Temple of Inanna at Uruk, inscribed during the reign of Amar-Sin, third king of the Ur-3 dynasty, approximately 2046 to 2038 BCE. The text is formulaic. The king names himself, invokes the goddess, describes the temple reconstruction. Then a detail. I rebuilt the Iana on its original foundation platform, which had been laid in ancient days. The phrase Kitush Gibil, ancient foundation, is standard in such inscriptions. But what follows is less common. The text specifies that the foundation was identified by the measurement of earlier walls, still visible beneath the floor of the temple he demolished. The old walls were not destroyed. They were uncovered, measured, and used as the template for the new construction. The new temple follows the plan of the old one, which followed the plan of the one before it. The foundation deposit does not describe how far back this pattern extends, only that it does extend. At Eridu, often identified as the oldest continually occupied site in southern Mesopotamia, excavations in the late 1940s by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd uncovered a stratigraphic sequence of temples spanning nearly 2 millennia. 17 successive building phases, each temple constructed directly above the ruins of the previous one, each following approximately the same layout. A central chamber with an offering platform, flanked by smaller rooms, oriented toward the same cardinal direction. The earliest structure, Temple 1, dates to the Ubaid period, around 5400 BCE. The latest, Temple 17, was in use during the early dynastic period. The site was never abandoned. Each collapse or decay was followed by reconstruction, and each reconstruction adhered to the spatial logic of what came before. The walls shifted slightly, the dimensions varied, but the overall plan remained stable. The central platform remained central. The orientation remained fixed. The continuity was architectural and spatial. Later Sumerian tradition identified Eridu as the first city, the place where kingship first descended, the cult center of the god Enki, lord of the subterranean waters and of wisdom. But the texts do not describe the founding of Eridu. They describe Eridu as already ancient, already sacred, already central. The city exists in the texts as a reference point, not as an innovation. Its temples are always being rebuilt, never being built for the first time. Foundation deposits from other cities show similar patterns. At beneath the floor of the temple of Nana, the moon god, excavators found cone-shaped clay inscriptions driven into the foundation walls, each inscribed with the name of the king who built or rebuilt the structure. The cones are layered, earlier kings' cones beneath later kings' cones, sometimes spanning centuries. The foundation is cumulative. Each builder adds to the deposit, marking his contribution to the continuity of the site. No one claims to be the first. The earliest cone says the temple was rebuilt. Rebuilt implies it was built before. But the earlier building is not described. The site of Nippur, cult center of Enlil, chief of the Sumerian pantheon, was excavated beginning in the 1880s by American expeditions from the University of Pennsylvania. The temple complex, known as the Ekur, showed evidence of continuous occupation and reconstruction from the Ubaid period through the Parthian period, a span of over 4,000 years. The sacred precinct remained fixed. The city grew and contracted around it, but the temple's location never shifted. Inscriptions from multiple dynasties describe the Ekur as the navel of the world, the place where heaven and earth meet, the site where divine authority is established. But none of the inscriptions explain why this particular location holds that significance. The sacredness of the site is treated as inherent, not conferred. The city does not make the site sacred. The site's sacredness makes the city important. Foundation rituals described in later Sumerian and Akkadian texts include the deposition of inscribed tablets, metal figurines, stone plaques, and precious materials beneath the corners of temples. These deposits are not structural, they are symbolic. They mark the continuity of the building with earlier structures, the continuity of the king's reign with earlier reigns, the continuity of the god's presence with earlier manifestations. The ritual acknowledges that this building stands where other buildings stood, that this ground is not ordinary ground, that the space has been marked before. The deposits are buried where no one will see them. They are not for public display. They are for the gods, for future kings, for the next builder who will dig down to find them and know that he is not the first. At Lagash, excavations in the early 20th century uncovered the temple of Ningirsu, patron god of the city. The site had been rebuilt repeatedly from the early dynastic period through the Neo-Sumerian period. Each phase of construction included foundation deposits referencing earlier rulers. Gudea, the best-known ruler of Lagash, left numerous inscribed statues and cylinders describing his reconstruction of the Eninu, the temple of Ningirsu. The texts are detailed, describing the sourcing of materials from distant lands, the precise measurements used, the rituals performed. But the language is restorative. Gudea dreams that the god instructs him to rebuild the temple. The god provides the plan. Gudea follows it. The temple is not designed by human creativity. It is revealed by divine instruction, and the instruction describes a structure that corresponds to what was there before. The plan is ancient. The execution is contemporary. The building is both. This practice, building on the same site, following the same orientation, preserving the same spatial relationships, suggests that the sacred geography of Sumer was fixed early and remained fixed. The cities moved slightly. Riverbeds shifted. Populations fluctuated. But the temple remained where the temple had been. The location was not chosen anew by each generation. It was inherited. Even when a city was destroyed, when occupation lapsed, when the political order collapsed, the returnees rebuilt the temple on the old foundation. They did not select a new site. They recovered the old one. How was the location preserved across periods of abandonment? In some cases, the ruins themselves were visible, marking the spot. But in other cases, the site had been buried under silt or sand, and the returnees still located the original foundation. This suggests the transmission of knowledge, either through oral tradition or through records now lost. Someone remembered where the temple had been. Someone preserved the knowledge of the correct location. And when rebuilding became possible, that knowledge was applied. The continuity was not accidental. It was intentional. The architectural evidence aligns with the textual emphasis on restoration. Kings did not claim to have discovered new sacred sites. They claim to have restored old ones. The language is consistent. The foundation is ancient. The location is original. The plan follows divine instruction, and the instruction describes what was done before. The innovation is in the craftsmanship, in the quality of the materials, in the dedication and piety of the builder. But the template is old. The sacred is where it has always been.
This raises a question about the origin of the sacred geography itself. At some point, the first structure must have been built on each site. But that first structure is not described in the texts. The texts describe temples being rebuilt, restored, refounded, but they do not describe temples being founded for the first time. The origin of the sacred site recedes into the time before the record begins. The archive preserves the continuity, but not the start. What remains in the archaeological and textual record is a pattern. Temples built on older footprints, foundations laid on ancient foundations, sacred space maintained across collapse and restoration, century after century, millennium after millennium, as if the location itself were the memory, as if the ground held knowledge that persisted longer than the buildings, longer than the dynasties, longer than the texts. The temple falls, the temple is rebuilt, the location does not change. And each time it is rebuilt, the inscriptions say the same thing. This is where it was before. This is where it belongs. This is where it will be again. Tablet VAT 209 plus VAT 4892, a composite cuneiform text housed in Berlin, was first published in transliteration in 1955. The text is a list of star names and numerical sequences dating to the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1800 BCE, but the content reflects Sumerian terminology and systems from at least 5 centuries earlier. The list is not explanatory. It does not define the stars or describe their appearance. It simply names them. Mul, the Pleiades; Gud-an-Nar, the Bull of Heaven or Taurus; Shu-Pa, Arcturus or part of Bootes; Sag-Megar, Jupiter, and others. Each name is followed by numerical notations indicating position, timing, or association with calendar periods. The system is operational. The stars are already identified. The periods are already known. The tablet is a reference list, not an instructional text. It assumes the reader already understands what the names signify. What is striking about early Sumerian astronomical texts is the absence of developmental stages. There are no records of trial and error, no texts showing the gradual identification of constellations, no documentation of discoveries. The earliest star lists, from the late 3rd millennium BCE, present a complete system. Constellations identified, names assigned, associations with gods and seasonal markers established. The system is not primitive. It is systematic, comprehensive, and standardized across multiple scribal centers. The Sumerian term for constellation, Mul, literally means star, but functions as a category label for asterisms, groups of stars treated as a unit. The earliest attested Mul lists include many of the same constellations that later Babylonian astronomy would refine and that Greek astronomy would inherit. The continuity of the system across cultures and languages suggests the framework was stable and authoritative. It was transmitted, not reinvented. The calendar systems that depended on astronomical observation appear similarly complete from their earliest appearances. The Sumerian calendar was lunisolar, based on lunar months, but adjusted periodically to keep the seasons aligned with the solar year. This requires accurate observation of both lunar phases and the solar year's length, as well as a method for intercalation, inserting additional months to correct the drift. The earliest administrative documents from the Ur-III period, around 2100 BCE, record intercalary months using the term diri, extra, or additional. The system was already functioning. The scribes knew when to add the extra month. They did not record how they made the decision. The knowledge was assumed. The Mul-Apin tablets, compiled in the late 2nd millennium BCE, but reflecting much earlier observations, contain extensive astronomical data. Rising and setting times for stars, lengths of daylight through the year, planetary movements, eclipse possibilities. The precision of the observations and the complexity of the mathematical models embedded in these texts indicates centuries of accumulated data. But the earlier sources from which Mul-Apin drew
are lost or fragmentary. The knowledge existed before the compilation, but the records of its development are absent. At Uruk, archaeologists recovered a tablet from a late 4th millennium context, approximately 3200 to 3000 BCE, containing what may be the earliest known reference to astronomical observation. The tablet is damaged, the text incomplete, but it includes notation related to the planet Venus and a numerical sequence that may indicate synodic periods, the time between successive appearances of the planet in the same position relative to the Sun. If the interpretation is correct, it means that Sumerian observers were tracking planetary cycles systematically at the very beginning of the written record. They were not discovering that planets move, they were documenting how they move. The role of astronomy in Sumerian religion and administration was central. The gods were associated with celestial bodies, Inanna with Venus, Nanna with the moon, Utu with the sun. Festivals were timed to celestial events. The New Year festival, the Akitu, was tied to the spring equinox. The lunar months dictated the religious calendar. Omens were derived from celestial phenomena, lunar eclipses, planetary conjunctions, the appearance of comets. But the omen texts do not describe the discovery of these associations, they present them as established. The celestial event means this because it has always meant this. The relationship between the sky and human affairs was encoded early and remained consistent. Sumerian temple architecture reflects astronomical awareness. The ziggurats, massive stepped temple platforms, were often oriented to cardinal directions with precision. The corners align to the solstices or equinoxes. The layout reflects celestial geometry. But the texts do not describe this alignment as an innovation. They describe it as correct, as the way temples should be built, as the pattern given by the gods. The alignment is not explained, it is demonstrated. Later Babylonian astronomers refined Sumerian methods, developing predictive models for planetary motion and eclipse cycles that were accurate enough to influence Greek astronomy, and, through the Greeks, the development of European astronomy. But the Babylonian refinements were extensions of existing methods, not departures. The framework was Sumerian. The constellations, the lunisolar calendar, the base 60 number system used for astronomical calculations. The innovations were computational, not conceptual. The system was already there. What is missing from the record is the origin of the framework. At what point were the constellations named? Who decided which stars belonged to which group? How was the association between celestial events and agricultural or religious cycles established? The earliest texts treat these questions as already answered. The constellations are named. The associations are known. The calendar is functioning. There is no narrative of discovery, no record of the first observer, no account of how the knowledge was obtained. Astronomy in Sumer appears as an inherited science. The scribes learn it from their teachers, who learned it from theirs. The knowledge is transmitted through the scribal schools, copied into reference tablets, applied to the calendar and to omen interpretation. But the source of the knowledge is not documented. The texts refer to the wisdom of the sages, the Abgal, who lived before the flood and who taught the arts of civilization, including astronomy. But the Abgal are not described as discoverers. They are described as transmitters. They knew because they were taught by the gods. The gods knew because the gods created the heavens. The knowledge originates with the divine and is passed to humanity through intermediaries. The human role is to preserve it, to apply it, to maintain the accuracy of the observations and the calculations. The system requires precision. A lunisolar calendar that drifts out of alignment with the seasons becomes useless. Omens that do not correspond to actual celestial events lose credibility. The maintenance of the system depends on continuous observation, careful record-keeping, and accurate transmission from one generation to the next. The Sumerian and Babylonian scribes sustained that transmission for over 3,000 years, from the earliest star lists to the latest Babylonian astronomical diaries. The continuity is extraordinary. It suggests institutional stability, archival integrity, and a cultural commitment to the preservation of knowledge. But it also raises the question of where the system came from originally. If the earliest texts already show a complete system, and if that system was transmitted without fundamental alteration for millennia, when and how was the system established? The record does not answer. The stars were already named when the first tablets were written. The calendar was already structured when the first year names were recorded. The associations between celestial phenomena and terrestrial events were already established when the first omen texts were composed. The knowledge was inherited. But from whom? From the sages before the flood, the texts say. But the sages are mythological figures, not historical individuals. The reference to them is a way of saying, this knowledge is older than our records. It comes from before the time we can document. It was given, not discovered. The archive preserves it, but the archive does not claim to be its origin. And so the stars remain named, their paths recorded, their significance transmitted, century after century, as if the first observer still looked up at the sky and saw what we see now, saw the same constellations, marked the same cycles, and passed that seeing forward into the long record, into the tablets and the lists, into the system that survived the cities, survived the dynasties, survived the languages, and remains still intact, still naming what it named before, the stars that were already named. Tablet HS 229, part of the Hilprecht collection at Jena, is a mathematical text from the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1800 BCE. The text is a problem set for scribal students, presenting geometric and arithmetic exercises. One problem involves calculating the area of a rectangular field, given the length of one side and the diagonal. The method used is algebraically sophisticated, involving the Pythagorean theorem more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. The tablet does not derive the theorem, it applies it. The method is presented as known, as standard, as part of the scribal curriculum. The student is expected to recognize the procedure and execute it correctly. There is no explanation of why the method works, only a demonstration of how to use it. The assumption is that the mathematical relationships are already understood. At Nippur, thousands of school tablets were excavated from the scribal quarter, dating to the Old Babylonian period. These tablets include multiplication tables, division tables, tables of squares and square roots, tables of cubes and cube roots, reciprocal tables, and tables of exponential functions, all computed in base 60. The tables are extensive, precise, and standardized. Different scribal schools in different cities used the same tables, suggesting a shared curriculum and a centralized tradition of mathematical training. But the origin of the tables is not recorded. The earliest examples already show the complete system. There is no evidence of a gradual development from simpler to more complex methods. The system appears fully operational. The Sumerian and Babylonian number system was sexagesimal, based on the number 60. This system is highly divisible. 60 can be divided evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes it exceptionally convenient for fractional arithmetic, for dividing measures, for proportional calculations. The choice of base 60 is sophisticated. It is not intuitive. A base 10 system, corresponding to human fingers, is simpler conceptually. But a base 60 system is more powerful mathematically. The Sumerians used base 60 for calculations, but base 10 for some counts, switching between systems depending on the context. This dual system appears in the earliest administrative tablets from Uruk. The scribes already knew when to use which system. The distinction was already functional. Metrology, the system of measurement, was equally complex. The Sumerians used different units for different kinds of measurement: length, area, volume, weight. Each category had its own scale, and the ratios between units within a scale were not uniform. A cubit was divided into smaller units, but the divisions were not decimal or even sexagesimal. They followed ratios specific to the task: construction, textile production, field measurement. The system was practical, tailored to the activities it measured. But it was not simple. It required training to use correctly, and it appears fully developed in the earliest administrative texts. There is no evidence of experimentation or simplification over time. The system was inherited, transmitted, and maintained. Mathematical problem texts from the Old Babylonian period include exercises in areas we would now classify as algebra. The problems are often framed as practical scenarios, dividing an inheritance, calculating the yield of a field, constructing a building. But the mathematical techniques are abstract. The scribes manipulated unknowns, solved quadratic equations, worked with proportional relationships. The terminology is geometric: length, width, area, but the operations are algebraic. The scribes did not have symbolic notation. They worked with words and numbers arranged in columnar format, but the logic is rigorous and consistent. One text, known as Plimpton 322, now housed at Columbia University, is a table of Pythagorean triples, sets of three integers that satisfy the equation a squared plus b squared equals c squared. The tablet is fragmentary, but the surviving portion lists 15 triples, arranged in order of decreasing ratio between the shorter sides. The precision of the table and the systematic arrangement suggest that the scribe understood the underlying mathematical relationships. The tablet is not an exploration of the Pythagorean theorem. It is a reference table compiled for use in other calculations. The knowledge was already systematized. The economic and administrative applications of mathematics in Sumer were extensive. Labour was calculated in man-days. Rations were distributed according to complex formulas, accounting for age, gender, and occupation. Taxes were assessed as proportions of yield, adjusted for field size, soil quality, and irrigation status. Loans carried interest, compounded monthly. The interest rates themselves were expressed as fractions, and the calculations required precision to avoid disputes. The entire system depended on accurate arithmetic and record-keeping. The scribes who managed this system were trained from childhood in the Eduba, the scribal school. The curriculum was rigorous, copying lexical lists, memorizing mathematical tables, practicing accounting problems, learning legal formulae, studying literary texts. The training took years. It was not accessible to everyone. Scribes formed a professional class, essential to the functioning of the state. Their knowledge was specialized, transmitted through apprenticeship and institutional training. But the curriculum did not include the history of mathematics. It included the application of mathematics. The tables were to be memorized, not derived. The methods were to be learned, not questioned. The goal was practical competence, not theoretical understanding. This utilitarian approach does not mean the Sumerians lacked theoretical insight. The precision of their mathematical methods, the sophistication of their problem-solving techniques, the abstraction of their algebraic thinking, all indicate deep understanding. But that understanding was embedded in practice, not separated into theory. The knowledge was what you could do, not what you could explain. Later Greek mathematics would emphasize proof, derivation, and logical structure. Sumerian mathematics emphasized procedure, accuracy, and application. Both approaches are valid. Both produce results. But they reflect different relationships to knowledge. The Greeks sought to understand why mathematical relationships hold. The Sumerians sought to apply them correctly. The distinction suggests different cultural priorities, different modes of transmission, different definitions of what it means to know. The absence of explanatory texts in Sumerian mathematics does not mean the knowledge was shallow. It means the knowledge was procedural, embedded in the training and practice of the scribal profession. The scribes knew how to calculate areas, solve equations, compound interest, divide inheritances. They did not need to write down why the methods worked, because the methods were taught directly, demonstrated, practiced, and tested. The knowledge was in the doing. But this leaves unanswered the question of origin. Who first compiled the multiplication tables? Who first recognized the Pythagorean relationship? Who first established the base 60 system and the complex metrological scales? The tablets do not say. The earliest mathematical texts already assume the system is in place. The training begins with memorization of the tables. The tables are presented as authoritative, as correct, as the foundation on which further learning is built. There is no suggestion that the tables were recently created or that they might be improved or revised. They are what they are, and the student's task is to internalize them. The continuity of the mathematical tradition across millennia suggests the system was stable and successful. It worked. It met the needs of the economy, the administration, the religious calendar, the architectural projects. There was no pressure to change it. And so it was transmitted, generation after generation, scribe to student, school to school, city to city, empire to empire, from the Sumerians to the Akkadians, to the Babylonians, to the Assyrians. Each culture inheriting the system and adding refinements, but not altering the core. The base 60 system survives today in the measurement of time, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and in angular measurement, 360 degrees in a circle. These are direct inheritances from Sumerian mathematics, transmitted through Babylonian astronomy to Greek science, to the Islamic world, to medieval Europe, to the modern global standard. The continuity is unbroken. The system we use now to measure time and angles is the system the Sumerians used 4,000 years ago, but we do not know where the Sumerians got it. The system was there when the record begins. It was fully functional, fully systematized, fully integrated into the administration and the calendar and the economy. The numbers appear without a childhood. They arrive already mature. And the question of how they grew, where they came from, who first counted in 60s and recognized the power of that base, remains unanswered. The tablets show the system in use. They do not show the system being born. The code of Ur-Nammu, inscribed on clay tablets dating to approximately 2100 BCE, is the oldest known written law collection. The prologue describes Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, as appointed by the gods to establish justice in the land after a period of disorder. The prologue does not say Ur-Nammu invented the laws, it says he enforced them. The laws themselves are presented as statements of what is just, without attribution to Ur-Nammu's personal judgment or innovation. The format is conditional. If a man does X, then Y will follow. The structure assumes the relationship between X and Y is established, not created by the king. The law describes consequences that follow from actions as if those consequences are inherent, not decreed. The term nigsisar, translated as justice or equity, appears throughout the prologue. The phrase nigsisar jar, to establish justice, does not mean to create new law. It means to restore order, to ensure that what should happen does happen, to remove obstacles that prevent the proper functioning of justice. The laws are framed as the proper functioning of society, not as innovations imposed on society. They describe how things ought to work, how they worked before, how they should work again. The legal content of the Code of Ur-Nammu covers cases involving violence, property, family relations, and social status. The penalties are specific: fines measured in silver, compensations proportional to harm, procedures for testimony and dispute resolution. The precision suggests the laws are not theoretical. They are practical, intended for application in actual cases. But the laws are not exhaustive. They cover representative cases, providing principles that can be extended to similar situations. The assumption is that judges know how to apply the principles. The law provides guidance, not a comprehensive manual. This implies the existence of a legal tradition, a body of knowledge shared among judges and administrators, a framework within which written law operates, but which is not fully contained in the written law. Later legal collections follow the same pattern. The Code of Lipit Ishtar, from approximately 1930 BCE, and the Code of Hammurabi from approximately 1750 BCE. Both present laws as established order, not as legislative innovation. Hammurabi's prologue is more elaborate, but the message is the same. The gods appointed the king to make justice visible, to ensure the weak are not oppressed, to restore equity. The laws are described as words of righteousness, but they are not attributed to Hammurabi as author. He is the enforcer, the guarantor, the one who makes the law effective. The law itself is presented as pre-existing. The structure of these law collections, conditional statements, representative cases, penalties expressed in fixed measures, suggests they are codifications of customary law, written expressions of norms that were already recognized. The innovation is not the law. The innovation is writing it down, making it public, creating a standard reference that can be consulted. But the writing does not create the law. It records it. The distinction is significant. If law is created by the king, then the king's authority is the source of justice. If law is recorded by the king, then the king's authority derives from his role as custodian of justice that exists independently of him. The Sumerian legal texts lean toward the second interpretation. The king does not claim to be the origin of justice. He claims to be its servant, its enforcer, the one who restores it when it has been disrupted. The legitimacy of his rule depends on his fidelity to justice, not on his power to define it. This has implications for how authority is understood. The king's role is not to impose his will, but to align his will with an objective standard. The standard is older than the king. The king's task is to recognize it, uphold it, and apply it. Deviation from the standard is not strength, it is failure. The king who does not uphold justice loses legitimacy. The gods withdraw their favor, the order collapses. The emphasis on justice as restoration rather than creation appears also in legal procedure. Sumerian and Akkadian legal documents, contracts, court records, deeds, often invoke the gods as witnesses. The transaction is not simply between parties, it is performed in the presence of divine authority, which ensures the agreement is binding. The gods do not create the terms of the contract, they witness and enforce them. The terms are agreed upon by the parties, but the enforceability derives from the divine framework within which the agreement is made. Oaths play a central role. In cases where evidence is insufficient, a party may be required to swear an oath before the gods. The oath invokes divine punishment for falsehood. The assumption is that the gods know the truth, that they will act to punish the liar, and that the fear of divine punishment is sufficient to ensure honesty. The system depends on shared belief in divine oversight, in the reality of divine justice, in the certainty that falsehood will be detected and punished, even if human judges cannot detect it. This reliance on oaths suggests that Sumerian law operated within a larger cosmological framework. Justice was not merely a social convention, it was a reflection of divine order. The gods established the order of the cosmos. Human law was meant to reflect that order. To violate the law was to violate the cosmic structure, to introduce disorder into the world. The consequences were not only social or legal, they were ontological. The wrongdoer disrupted the fabric of reality. Justice restored it. Legal titles and roles in Sumerian administration reinforce this interpretation. The term dikud, judge, literally means one who cuts the verdict. The image is precise. The judge separates truth from falsehood, right from wrong, the lawful from the unlawful. The cutting is not arbitrary. It follows the contours of the case, the pattern established by the law. The judge discerns the correct outcome. He does not invent it. The role of the judge is to see clearly, to apply the law accurately, to render a decision that corresponds to the truth of the matter. The decision is not the judge's opinion, it is the law's application. The term nigzi, truth, or the true thing, is used in legal contexts to describe claims that are accurate, testimony that is honest, decisions that are correct. Truth is objective. It exists independently of the speaker. The task of the court is to uncover it, to bring it to light, to make it the basis of the judgment. Legal proceedings are investigative, not adversarial in the modern sense. The goal is not to win, but to establish what happened, what is owed, what is just. The archive of legal documents from Sumerian cities shows consistency across time and space. Contracts follow standard formulas, witnesses are named, seals are impressed. The documents are filed in archives maintained by temples or palaces. The archives function as institutional memory, preserving records that can be consulted in case of dispute. The reliability of the archive depends on the integrity of the scribes, the security of the storage, and the continuity of the institution. The Sumerian legal system assumes that continuity. It assumes the archive will persist, that records will remain accessible, that past decisions can inform present cases. The collapse of that assumption, when archives are destroyed, when institutions fail, when records are lost, constitutes a collapse of justice itself. The legal texts often invoke earlier precedents. A case is decided not only according to the written law, but also according to how similar cases were decided before. This reliance on precedent implies a legal tradition extending back in time, a body of decisions forming a coherent whole. The written codes are part of that tradition, but they are not the whole of it. The tradition is larger, older, and more comprehensive than any single text. The judge operates within the tradition, drawing on it, extending it, but not departing from it. Innovation in legal reasoning is constrained by the need for continuity with past practice. The system values stability, predictability, and fidelity to established norms. The absence of attribution in legal texts parallels the absence of attribution in other Sumerian knowledge systems. The laws do not name their author. The mathematics does not name its inventor. The astronomy does not describe its discovery. The architecture does not celebrate its innovator. In each case, the knowledge is presented as received, as inherited, as part of the order that exists and must be maintained. The individuals who transmit the knowledge are custodians, not creators. Their task is to preserve, to apply, to pass forward accurately. The system depends on their competence and their fidelity, but it does not depend on their originality. The law, like the temple, like the calendar, like the number system, is something already there when the record begins. The scribes document it, the kings enforce it, the judges apply it, but none of them claim to have made it. It exists, and they serve it, and in that service the order continues. But the origin of the order, the source of the law, the moment when justice was first defined, those remain outside the record. The law was there when kingship descended, and where the law came from, the tablets do not say. Tablet CBS 10673, part of the University of Pennsylvania's collection, is a medical prescription from the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1800 BCE. The tablet is written in Akkadian, but includes Sumerian logograms for medical terms and plant names. The prescription is formulaic, the ailment is named, the ingredients are listed, the preparation is described, the application is specified. The text does not explain why the treatment works. It does not describe the discovery of the remedy. It presents the treatment as established knowledge, as something already known, as part of the physician's training. The language is instructional but not exploratory. The physician is not experimenting. The physician is applying a method. The term used for physician in Sumerian is azu, literally water knower, a compound that has resisted clear interpretation but suggests specialized knowledge of purification, fluids, or the body's internal processes. The physician's role was both practical and ritual. Medical treatments included herbal remedies, surgical procedures, incantations, and purifications. The distinction between medicine and magic was not sharp. Disease was understood as having both physical and spiritual dimensions. Treatment addressed both. The remedy and the incantation were complementary, not contradictory. Medical texts from Sumer and later Mesopotamian periods include lists of symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments. These texts are organized systematically, often following a head-to-toe structure: ailments of the head, the eyes, the chest, the abdomen, the limbs. The organization suggests a body of knowledge accumulated over time, categorized for reference, transmitted through training. The texts are not narratives of individual cases, they are compendia, reference works, manuals. The knowledge is generalized, abstracted from individual experience into principles that can be applied broadly. The remedies themselves often cite tradition. A treatment may be described as according to the words of the ancients, or as was done in the time of the sages. The authority of the treatment derives from its age, from its continuity with earlier practice, from its attribution to sources recognized as authoritative. The physician does not innovate. The physician remembers, applies, transmits. To depart from the traditional remedy is to risk error, to lose the benefit of accumulated knowledge, to sever the connection with the source of the healing art. One set of texts, known as the Treatise of Medical Diagnosis and Prognosis, compiled in the 1st millennium BCE, but drawing on much earlier sources, attributes medical knowledge to the antediluvian sage Uan, the first of the Abgal. Uan is described as having received knowledge from the god Ea and having transmitted it to humanity. The knowledge includes medicine, incantation, divination, and ritual. The transmission is vertical, from God to sage to humanity. The human physician is the endpoint of this chain, the custodian of knowledge that originates in the divine realm. The role is priestly as much as practical. The physician mediates between the patient and the knowledge that can heal. Medical instruments and procedures described in Sumerian and Akkadian texts include lancets for bleeding, bandages, salves, poultices, suppositories, and enemas. The texts describe surgical interventions, setting broken bones, draining abscesses, treating wounds. The level of anatomical knowledge implied by these procedures is considerable. The physicians understood the body's structure well enough to intervene effectively, but the texts do not include anatomical diagrams or descriptions of dissection. The knowledge is practical and observational, not systematically theoretical. The body is understood through its symptoms, its responses to treatment, its patterns of illness and recovery. Plant-based remedies are central to Sumerian medicine. The texts list hundreds of plants, often by name only, with no description of their appearance or habitat. The assumption is that the physician knows the plants, can identify them, knows how to prepare them. The knowledge is specialized, transmitted through apprenticeship, learned by observation and practice. Some plant names are obscure, their identifications uncertain even today. The knowledge was specific, local, embedded in the environment. It depended on direct familiarity with the natural world. Incantations accompanying medical treatments often invoke gods associated with healing: Ninurta, Gula, Damu. The incantation describes the ailment, identifies the cause, and commands the illness to depart. The language is performative. The words are not descriptions, they are actions. To speak the incantation is to enact the cure. The effectiveness of the incantation depends on the correct recitation, the proper ritual context, and the authority of the speaker. The physician must know not only the remedy, but also the words, the gestures, the timing. The cure is a complex performance, not a simple application of a substance. Divination played a role in diagnosis. Symptoms were interpreted as signs, omens indicating divine displeasure or supernatural intervention. The healer consulted omen texts, performed rituals to determine the cause of the illness, and prescribed both physical remedies and ritual purifications. The diagnosis was not only medical, but also cosmological. Illness was a disruption of the patient's relationship with the divine order. Healing required restoring that relationship. Medical knowledge was preserved in libraries attached to temples and palaces. The library at Nineveh, assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, contained extensive medical compendia copied from earlier Babylonian sources, which themselves drew on earlier Sumerian and Akkadian texts. The continuity of transmission is clear. The same remedies, the same formulas, the same invocations appear across centuries, copied and recopied, transmitted from scribe to scribe, from city to city, from dynasty to dynasty. The continuity was intentional. The knowledge was too valuable to lose. The scribes who copied medical texts understood their task as preservation. They noted when a tablet was damaged, when a word was unclear, when a section was missing. They indicated gaps in the text with markers. They did not fill in the gaps with guesses. They preserved the uncertainty, acknowledging that the knowledge they transmitted was incomplete, that earlier sources had been lost, that restoration was possible only to the extent that the record survived. The scribal colophons on medical tablets sometimes include prayers that the text remain intact, that future generations preserve it, that the knowledge not be lost. The fear of forgetting is explicit. The knowledge is fragile. It depends on the archive, on the care of the scribes, on the continuity of the institutions that maintain the texts. When the institutions collapse, when libraries are burned, when cities are abandoned, the knowledge is lost. And when the knowledge is lost, the treatments are forgotten. The illnesses remain, but the remedies disappear. Later traditions attributed the origins of medicine to the gods and the antediluvian sages, but those attributions function as acknowledgements of incompleteness. The texts say, "We do not know where this knowledge came from originally. It is older than our records. It was given to us. Our task is to preserve it and apply it faithfully." The physician does not claim to have discovered the cure. The physician claims to know the cure, to have learned it from a teacher, who learned it from a teacher, who learned it from texts that were old when they were first copied. The chain extends back beyond the reach of documentation. The knowledge is inherited, but the origin of the inheritance is obscure. Medical practice in this framework is an act of memory. To treat the patient is to remember the remedy. To remember the remedy is to maintain the link with the source of the knowledge. The physician's authority derives from that link, from the continuity of the tradition, from the fidelity with which the knowledge has been transmitted. To break the link is to lose the authority. The remedy ceases to be reliable. The treatment loses its power. The tradition collapses. And so the knowledge is guarded, copied, transmitted with care. It is not improved, it is not revised, it is preserved. The goal is not innovation, but continuity. The best physician is the one who knows the old remedies, who can recite the ancient incantations, who follows the methods described in the texts compiled by the sages. The best medicine is the medicine that has worked before, and the question of how it came to work, how it was discovered, who first identified the plant or the procedure or the incantation, that question is subsumed into the larger claim. The knowledge was given. The gods gave it. The sages transmitted it. We preserve it. The knowledge is not ours. We are its custodians. And the tablets, the remedies, the incantations, the procedures, all of them say the same thing. This is how it was done before. This is how it should be done now. This is what was preserved, and this is what we pass forward. Tablet AO 6702, housed in the Louvre, is a Sumerian administrative text from Gursu, dated to the reign of Gudea, approximately 2120 BCE. The text is a labour allocation record, listing workers assigned to canal maintenance. The workers are organised into groups of 10, each group supervised by a foreman. The foreman report to an overseer. The overseer reports to the temple administration. The structure is hierarchical, bureaucratic, and precise. Each worker is named. Each task is specified. Each day of labour is recorded. The system is not ad hoc. It is organised, standardised, and embedded in a larger administrative apparatus that extends across the city-state. This is not the beginning of bureaucracy. This is bureaucracy already functioning. The cuneiform tablets from Gursu, Umma, and other cities of the Ur III period provide an extraordinarily detailed picture of Sumerian administration. Tens of thousands of documents survive: ration lists, work assignments, tax receipts, inventory records, loan agreements, legal contracts. The volume of documentation reflects the scale and complexity of the system. Every transaction, every allocation, every obligation was recorded. The archive was not optional, it was the system. Without the record, the transaction did not exist. The precision of the record-keeping is striking. Workers received rations calculated according to their age, gender, and occupation. Adult male labourers received a standard ration expressed in seela of barley, a unit equivalent to approximately 1 litre. Women received slightly less. Children received less still. Skilled workers received supplements. The calculations are exact. The totals are checked. Discrepancies are noted and corrected. The system depends on numerical accuracy, on the reliable functioning of the scribal apparatus, on the archive's integrity. The administrative structure underlying these documents was already complex in the early dynastic period. More than a millennium before the Ur-3 state refined it to its peak efficiency. Early tablets from Shuruppak, dating to around 2600 BCE, show similar organizational principles. Workers grouped hierarchically, tasks specified, rations allocated, records maintained. The system was not invented by the Ur-3 kings. It was inherited, expanded, and perfected, but its origins are earlier still. The earliest administrative tablets from Uruk, from around 3200 BCE, show the system already in operation. The tablets record transactions involving large institutions, temples, storehouses, administrative complexes. The institutions are already established. The system for managing them is already in place. The scribes who wrote these tablets knew what to record, how to record it, where to file it. The knowledge was institutional, embedded in the training of the scribes, in the structure of the archives, in the expectations of the overseers and the officials who reviewed the records. The role of the scribe was central. Scribes were trained in the eduba, the scribal school, from childhood. The training was long, rigorous, and specialized. Students learned to read and write cuneiform, to perform arithmetic, to follow administrative protocols, to draft legal documents, to compile inventories. The curriculum was standardized across cities and periods, suggesting a shared tradition, a common framework, a body of knowledge transmitted from generation to generation with little variation. The scribes formed a professional class, essential to the functioning of the state. Without scribes, the economy could not operate, taxes could not be collected, justice could not be administered, temples could not manage their estates, kings could not organize labor for public works. The scribe was not merely a recorder, the scribe was an enabler, a facilitator, a guarantor of the system's continuity. Administrative texts often include seals, cylindrical stamps rolled across the clay surface to create an impression. The seals identified the authority responsible for the document, the official who authorized the transaction, the institution that issued the record. The seal validated the document, made it official, embedded it in the system. The use of seals appears early in the archaeological record, alongside the earliest writing. The seal and the tablet are complementary technologies, both serving the same purpose, to make transactions permanent, verifiable, and authoritative. The content of the administrative documents is repetitive. The same formulas appear thousands of times. Received from X, delivered to Y for the account of Z. The language is standardized, the structure predictable. The repetition is intentional. It reduces ambiguity, ensures consistency, makes the records easier to process and verify. The system values clarity and precision, not literary elegance. The documents are tools, not compositions. They function within a framework that everyone involved understands. The cities themselves appear organized from their earliest levels. Urban planning in Sumer was not haphazard. Cities were divided into districts, residential quarters, craft workshops, administrative centers, temple precincts. Streets followed regular patterns, houses were built to standardized dimensions, canals and drainage systems were integrated into the city layout. The infrastructure required planning, coordination, and centralized authority. The cities did not grow organically from villages. They appear in the archaeological record as cities, large, organized, administered. The scale of urban organization is evident in the monumental architecture. Temples, ziggurats, city walls, palace complexes, all required massive labor mobilization, logistical coordination, resource allocation. The labor forces numbered in the thousands, sometimes tens of thousands. The workers were fed, housed, supervised. The materials were sourced from distant regions, transported, stockpiled, distributed. The projects took years, sometimes decades. The administration that managed these projects was sophisticated, capable, and experienced. It was not learning as it went, it was applying knowledge it already had. The question is where that knowledge came from. At what point did Sumerian society develop the administrative capacity to manage cities, to organize labor on a massive scale, to maintain archives, to standardize procedures? The earliest tablets show the system already in place. The earliest cities show the infrastructure already built. The earliest bureaucracies show the hierarchy already functioning. There is no archaeological or textual evidence of a gradual development from simple to complex. The system appears complex from the beginning. Some scholars have suggested that the administrative system developed in response to the needs of temple economies. The temples controlled large estates, employed workers, managed herds, stored surplus, distributed rations. The economic activity required record-keeping, which required writing, which required trained scribes, which required schools, which required a professional class. The system, in this view, emerged organically from economic necessity. But this explanation does not account for the sophistication of the earliest system. The step from no writing to complex administrative cuneiform is enormous. The cognitive and organizational leap required is profound. And the leap appears to have been taken suddenly, at least within the resolution of the archaeological record. One stratum contains no tablets, the next contains thousands. The transition is rapid. The suggestion that the system developed elsewhere, in a form not yet preserved or recognized, and was then transplanted to Sumer, faces the problem that no earlier or simpler system has been found anywhere. The tokens that preceded writing are simpler, but the transition from token to script is itself the mystery. The tokens recorded quantities. The tablets record complex transactions involving multiple parties, goods, and operations. The transition requires not only the invention of writing, but also the conceptual framework within which writing serves administration, the organizational structures that depend on writing, and the institutional commitment to maintaining the archive. All of this appears together as a system, not in stages. The Sumerian administrative apparatus was inherited by the Akkadian Empire, by the Ur-III state, by the Old Babylonian kingdoms, by the Assyrians, by the Neo-Babylonians, by the Persians. Each empire adapted the system, expanded it, refined it, but did not fundamentally alter it. The cuneiform script, the sexagesimal number system, the archival practices, the administrative vocabulary, all of these persisted across languages, across cultures, across millennia. The continuity is extraordinary. It suggests the system was effective, stable, and authoritative. It was worth preserving. It was too valuable to replace. But the continuity also raises the question of origin. The system that persisted for 3,000 years must have originated at some point. The tablets say it was already there when the record begins. The cities say they were organized when they were built. The scribes say they learned from their teachers, who learned from theirs. The knowledge was transmitted. But where did it start? And why does the beginning look so much like the middle, so complete, so functional, so organized, as if the system arrived already knowing what it was supposed to do? In the archives of the British Museum, tablet BM 96955 plus BM 102359 is a late Babylonian copy of an ancient list known as Anum Shah Ameli, compiled sometime in the first millennium BCE, but drawing on sources extending back to Sumerian times. The text is a catalogue of divine names and epithets, including an extended section on the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki are listed not as mythological figures, but as titles, as roles within a hierarchy, as functionaries. The list includes designations such as judge, counselor, one who determines fates, one who holds the tablet. The language is administrative. The Anunnaki are described in terms of their responsibilities, not their narratives. The term Anunnaki, written in Sumerian cuneiform as di Anunnakani, is conventionally translated as those of princely seed or offspring of Anu, Anu being the sky god, the highest deity in the Sumerian pantheon. But the term appears in contexts that are not mythological in the literary sense. The Anunnaki appear in administrative texts, in legal formulas, in dedications, in temple inventories. They are invoked as witnesses. They are named as recipients of offerings. They are described as present in the assembly of the gods, deliberating, rendering judgments, determining the fates of cities and kings. The descent of Inanna, one of the oldest Sumerian myths, describes the Anunnaki as judges in the underworld, seated in the assembly, rendering verdicts. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes references to the Anunnaki in contexts of judgment and cosmic order. The Atrahasis epic, which includes a Babylonian version of the flood narrative, describes the Anunnaki as labouring gods who eventually revolt against the burden of their work, leading to the creation of humanity. The roles are specific. The Anunnaki are not distant, abstract deities. They perform tasks. They have functions. They interact with the human and divine worlds in structured, defined ways. What is notable in Sumerian sources is the absence of the speculative narratives that later cultures, including our own, have imposed on the Anunnaki. The Sumerian texts do not describe the Anunnaki as aliens. They do not describe them as astronauts or genetic engineers. Those interpretations are modern, originating in the work of Zechariah Sitchin and others in the late 20th century, and they have no basis in the cuneiform texts themselves. The Sumerian scribes understood the Anunnaki as divine beings, members of the pantheon with specific roles in the cosmos and in the administration of divine justice. The Anunnaki are often contrasted with the Igigi, another group of deities. In the Atrahasis epic, the Igigi are the labouring gods who perform the physical work of maintaining the cosmos, digging canals, building infrastructure, managing resources. The Anunnaki are the overseers, the decision-makers, the administrators. The distinction is hierarchical. The Igigi execute, the Anunnaki direct. The structure parallels human social organization: laborers, foremen, overseers, officials. The divine world mirrors the human world, or perhaps more accurately, the human world is structured to reflect the divine. One of the most significant Anunnaki references appears in the Exaltation of Inanna, a hymn attributed to Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, high priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur, and one of the earliest named authors in history. The hymn, composed around 2300 BCE, describes Inanna's rise to prominence, her authority over the Anunnaki, her power to decree fates. The Anunnaki are described as bowing before her, acknowledging her supremacy. The language is political as much as religious. Inanna's authority is not derived from narrative action. It is asserted by decree, recognized by the assembly, confirmed by the other gods. The poem functions as a legitimization of Inanna's cult and, by extension, of the dynasty that sponsored the cult. The Anunnaki, in judicial contexts, are invoked as guarantors of oaths, enforcers of contracts, witnesses to truth. Sumerian legal documents often include the phrase, "May the Anunnaki judge him," or "May the Anunnaki determine his fate," as a closing formula. The invocation is not ornamental, it is functional. It places the agreement under divine supervision, ensuring that violations will be met with divine punishment. The human court may render a verdict, but the ultimate authority rests with the gods, and among the gods, the Anunnaki are the ones who execute judgment. The temple inventories and offering lists include allocations for the Anunnaki. They are recipients of rations, just as human administrators are. The offerings are listed by type and quantity: bread, beer, oil, meat. The Anunnaki are integrated into the economic system of the temple. They are provisioned. They are maintained. The relationship is reciprocal. The humans provide offerings, and the Anunnaki provide order, justice, protection. The system depends on the regularity of the offerings and the reliability of the divine response. The Anunnaki also appear in cosmological texts as the group of gods who determine the structure of the world. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes how the cosmos is organized after the defeat of Tiamat. The gods are assigned roles. The heavens and the earth are structured. The calendar is established. The duties are distributed. The Anunnaki are part of this organization. They are not creators in the sense of bringing the cosmos into being. They are organizers, administrators, the ones who implement the structure decided by the higher gods. The emphasis is on order, on roles, on the functioning of the system. This administrative character of the Anunnaki is consistent with the broader Sumerian worldview. The cosmos is governed. The gods are not capricious or arbitrary. They operate within a framework, following protocols, rendering judgments according to established principles. The divine assembly functions like a council, deliberating, voting, making decisions that are then enacted. The Anunnaki are the members of this council, the officials who translate divine will into cosmic action. What the texts do not provide is a narrative of origin for the Anunnaki themselves. They are present in the earliest sources as an established category. Their role is defined, but their origin is not explained. They are part of the pantheon, but the pantheon itself is not described as having been created at a specific moment. The gods exist. They have always existed. The myths describe conflicts among the gods, changes in divine hierarchy, redistributions of authority, but they do not describe the creation of the gods themselves. The gods are the given, the starting point, the framework within which the myths operate. The Anunnaki, as part of that framework, are inherited by the texts, not explained by them. Later interpretations, both ancient and modern, have expanded, altered, or distorted these roles. Greek and Roman authors who encountered Babylonian religion imposed their own categories, identifying Mesopotamian gods with their own deities, interpreting myths through the lens of their own cosmologies. Medieval Islamic and Jewish scholars preserved Babylonian materials but interpreted them within monotheistic frameworks. Modern esoteric and speculative traditions have taken the Anunnaki in directions that have no textual support, but that appeal to contemporary fascinations with ancient astronauts, lost civilizations, and hidden knowledge. The cuneiform texts themselves are more modest. They describe the Anunnaki as gods with specific roles in the divine order. They are judges, administrators, overseers. They determine fates, render verdicts, witness oaths. They receive offerings and maintain order. They are part of the structure that governs the cosmos and that the Sumerian scribes, kings, and priests sought to understand and uphold. The question that remains is whether the Anunnaki, as described in the texts, represent a memory of something historical, a group, an institution, a structure that was later mythologized, or whether they are purely theological constructs, symbolic representations of principles of order and justice. The texts do not resolve this question. They present the Anunnaki as real within the framework of Sumerian religion, as actors with agency, as beings who affect the world. But whether that reality was understood as metaphorical or literal, symbolic or material, the texts do not specify. The later traditions that claim the Anunnaki were physical beings, that they walked the earth, that they intervened in human history, these claims extend beyond what the Sumerian texts say. But the traditions that dismiss the Anunnaki as purely fictional as inventions of religious imagination also simplify what the texts preserve. The Anunnaki are described with precision, with consistency, with roles and functions that are specific and recurring. The texts treat them seriously. The scribes recorded their names, their titles, their responsibilities. The question of what that recording represents, memory, theology, both, neither, remains open. And the texts, in their careful cataloguing, in their administrative language, in their refusal to explain what they assume is already known, leave the question suspended, preserved in the archive, waiting. Excavations at Uruk in the 1920s and 1930s revealed architectural strata extending from the late Ubaid period, around 5000 BCE, through the early dynastic period, around 2900 BCE. The site showed continuous occupation, but the transition from village to city occurred suddenly in archaeological terms. The Uruk IV period, around 3400 to 3100 BCE, marks the appearance of monumental architecture, large-scale temple platforms, administrative complexes, and the earliest writing. The city covers approximately 5 square kilometers at its peak. The infrastructure includes defensive walls, residential quarters organized into districts, canal systems for water management, and centralized storage facilities. The organization is urban from the beginning of the Uruk IV horizon. It does not transition gradually from village to town to city. It appears as a city. The urban plan is structured. The city is divided into sacred and administrative precincts, residential zones, craft production areas. The organization implies planning, coordination, and centralized authority. Someone decided where the temple would stand, where the administrative complex would be located, where the city wall would run. The decisions reflect knowledge of urban management, of spatial organization, of the relationships between different functional zones. The earliest writing appears in this context, not before it. Writing serves the administration of the urban economy. The tablets record transactions essential to the functioning of the city, the distribution of rations to workers, the allocation of resources to craft specialists, the accounting of surplus stored in temple granaries. The city requires record-keeping. The record-keeping requires writing. Writing appears when the city appears. But the writing system is not simple. It is complex, standardized, and immediately employed across thousands of documents. The implication is that the system was developed before it was used, or that it was developed very rapidly during the Uruk IV period. Either way, the transition is compressed. The city appears organized, the writing appears systematic, the administration appears functional. Other cities in southern Mesopotamia, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, show similar patterns. They appear in the archaeological record as urban centers with monumental architecture, administrative systems, and complex economies. There is no extended period of experimentation, no gradual accumulation of urban features. The cities appear already structured. The pattern is repeated across multiple sites, suggesting a shared framework, a common model, a template that was applied broadly. The uniformity is striking. The cities are not identical, but they follow similar organizational principles. Central temple complexes, administrative archives, residential districts, defensive walls. The similarity suggests either rapid diffusion of urban knowledge or the implementation of a model that already existed. Some scholars have argued that the urban revolution in Sumer was driven by environmental factors, the need to manage irrigation in the alluvial plain, the concentration of population near water sources, the advantages of centralized coordination for large-scale agriculture. The theory is plausible, but it does not explain the speed of the transition or the sophistication of the earliest urban systems. Managing irrigation requires organization, but organization on the scale evident in the Uruk IV period requires prior knowledge, experience, and institutional capacity. The institutions appear to have been in place when the cities were built, not developed afterward. The administrative apparatus documented in the earliest tablets reflects an understanding of economic management, of resource allocation, of labor coordination that is not elementary. The system tracks inputs and outputs, manages inventories, allocates rations according to complex formulas, records obligations and debts. The sophistication suggests experience, accumulated knowledge, a tradition of practice. But the tradition is not documented before the cities. It appears with the cities, as if the knowledge and the urban form arrived together. The religious and political organization of Sumerian cities was centered on the temple. The temple was not only a place of worship, it was an economic institution, a landowner, an employer, a center of redistribution. The temple controlled large estates, employed workers, collected surplus, and distributed rations. The temple archives document this economic activity in exhaustive detail. The system is complex, hierarchical, and administered by a professional scribal class. The temple's role in the urban economy suggests it was central to the organization of the city, but the temple itself, as an institution, appears fully formed. The earliest temples at Uruk, Eridu, and other sites are already monumental, already central to the urban plan, already integrated into the economic system. There is no evidence of a gradual expansion from small shrine to large temple. The temples are large from the beginning. The urban phenomenon in Sumer has parallels elsewhere, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, in Mesoamerica. Each region developed urban centers independently, or so the conventional chronology suggests. But in each case, the cities appear suddenly in the archaeological record, organized and administered, without clear precedent in the earlier village cultures of the same regions. The pattern is global. The question is whether this reflects a universal human capacity for social organization, triggered by similar environmental and economic pressures, or whether it reflects the transmission of knowledge, the diffusion of a model, or the recovery of a template that existed before and was reapplied. The Sumerian texts do not address the question directly. They do not describe the founding of the first city. They describe cities as already existing, already functioning, already sacred. The city is where the gods dwell. The city is where order is maintained. The city is the center of the world. The surrounding countryside is peripheral, dangerous, unordered. Civilization is urban. The city is civilization. And the city in the texts is not invented. It is restored, rebuilt, re-established after each collapse, following the pattern that was there before. The King List places the first cities in the time before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. These cities are treated as ancient even in texts written millennia later. They are the original cities, the places where kingship first descended, the sites where the gods first established order. But the texts do not describe their founding. The cities are simply there, at the beginning of the record, already ancient, already central, already organized. The archaeological evidence from Eridu supports the claim of antiquity. The site shows continuous occupation from the Ubaid period onward. The temple sequence at Eridu is the longest continuous religious site in Mesopotamia, spanning over 2,000 years. The city's prominence in later Sumerian tradition reflects its actual antiquity. But even Eridu does not show the origin of urbanism. It shows urbanism already in place, already functioning, already sacred. The question of what came before remains unanswered. The villages that preceded the cities were smaller, simpler, less organized. They lacked monumental architecture, administrative archives, complex economies. The transition from village to city involved not only a change in scale, but a change in kind, the emergence of hierarchy, of specialization, of institutions, of writing, of the state. The transition is one of the most significant in human history, but in Sumer it appears compressed into a few centuries, and the result is not tentative. It is confident, organized, systematic. The cities arrive already knowing how to be cities, and the texts, when they begin to record the cities, treat them as already ancient, as restorations of an order that existed before, as recoveries of a pattern that was known. The origin of that pattern, the source of that knowledge, the moment when the first city was organized and the first administrators learned their tasks. Those remain outside the record. The cities were there when the writing began, and the writing says they had been there before. But how long before, and what stood in the place before the cities, the texts do not say. They only preserve the claim, "This is where we have always been. This is what we have always done. This is the order we inherit." The Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian composition known from a fragmentary tablet copied in the Old Babylonian period, but reflecting earlier traditions, includes a passage near its conclusion. After the flood, after Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, has survived and been granted eternal life, the text describes the restoration of kingship and the re-establishment of cities. The text specifies that 5 cities are restored: Eridu, Bad-Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. These are the same 5 cities listed in the Sumerian King List as the seats of kingship before the flood. The passage does not say the cities are founded, it says they are restored. The distinction is subtle but consistent. The flood destroys but does not erase. The cities return. But the return is not described as spontaneous. It is described as orchestrated by the gods, as a deliberate act of restoration, following the pattern that existed before. This pattern, restoration rather than creation, appears in another Sumerian composition, the Curse of Agade. The text describes the rise and fall of the city of Akkad, capital of Sargon's empire. The city's prosperity is attributed to the favour of the god Enlil. When the king Naram-Sin offends the gods, Enlil withdraws his favour, and the city is destroyed. The surrounding cities are also devastated. The text describes the destruction in detail: famine, invasion, abandonment. But the conclusion of the text does not describe the end of civilization. It describes the restoration of the other cities. Enlil turns his favour back to to Nippur, to Eridu. The kingship, which had been in Akkad, is transferred elsewhere. The order is disrupted, but not ended. The system continues. But what returns is not new, it is what was before. The lamentation over the destruction of composed after the fall of the III dynasty around 2004 BCE, is structured as a plea for restoration. The text describes the sacking of the city, the burning of the temples, the slaughter of the population, the cessation of rituals. But the lamentation is not a eulogy, it is a petition. The text calls on the gods to return, to rebuild, to restore what was. The language is explicit. The city should be restored to its rightful state, the temples rebuilt on their foundations, the rituals resumed as they were performed before. The assumption is that the correct state is known. The city had that state before, it should have it again. The problem is not uncertainty about what should be. The problem is the disruption that prevents what should be from existing. The concept of decline as forgetting appears also in the scribal tradition. Scribes who copied ancient texts sometimes noted that the original was damaged, that parts were illegible, that the language was archaic and difficult. These notes indicate an awareness that knowledge was being lost, that the archive was incomplete, that restoration was possible only to the extent that earlier texts survived. The task of the scribe was to preserve what could be preserved, to prevent further loss, to transmit accurately even when understanding was uncertain. The act of copying was an act of resistance against forgetting. The emphasis on restoration rather than innovation extends to royal ideology. Kings who consolidated power after periods of fragmentation described themselves as restorers of order, not as founders of new systems. The Akkadian term nirarum, meaning restoration or bringing back, appears in royal inscriptions describing the recovery of territory, the rebuilding of temples, the re-establishment of justice. The language is consistent. What the king achieves is not novelty, but return. He brings back what was lost. He restores what was interrupted. He re-establishes what had lapsed. The value placed on continuity over innovation reflects a worldview in which the ideal is not progress, but stability. Progress implies movement towards something better. Stability implies maintaining what is already correct. In the Sumerian worldview, the correct state existed in the past. The task of each generation is to maintain that state, to resist entropy, to push back against the forces of disorder. Collapse is natural, order requires effort, and the effort is not creative, it is restorative. Decline, in this framework, is not the failure to innovate, it is the failure to remember. When memory fails, the knowledge is lost. When the knowledge is lost, the practices lapse. When the practices lapse, the order collapses. The collapse is not a transition to something new, it is a regression to disorder, to chaos, to the state before order was established. The task of recovery is to remember what was done before, to restore the practices, to rebuild the institutions, to re-establish the order. The institutions that sustained memory, the temples, the palaces, the scribal schools, were vulnerable. War, famine, economic collapse, environmental catastrophe, all of these could disrupt the institutions. And when the institutions were disrupted, the archive was threatened. Tablets were not copied, schools were closed, temples were abandoned. The chain of transmission was broken. And when the chain was broken, knowledge was lost. Some knowledge could be recovered if the tablets survived. If the archive was buried but not destroyed, if the city was resettled, if the scribes returned, the tablets could be excavated, read, copied. The knowledge could be restored. But some knowledge was lost irretrievably. If the tablets were burned, if the archive was looted, if no one remained who could read the script, the knowledge disappeared. The recovery of that knowledge required rediscovery, relearning, reconstruction. But reconstruction was not preferred. Preservation was preferred. The best outcome was continuity. The worst outcome was forgetting. The archaeological record shows recurring cycles of collapse and recovery in Mesopotamia. The end of the early dynastic period, the fall of the Akkadian Empire, the collapse of Ur-III, the fragmentation of the Old Babylonian period, the Dark Age after the fall of the Kassite dynasty. Each collapse disrupted the institutions, each recovery involved rebuilding them, but the recovery was not uniform. Some cities recovered quickly, others were abandoned permanently. Some knowledge was preserved, other knowledge was lost. The pattern is clear. Collapse is recurring, recovery is possible, but recovery is not guaranteed. It depends on the survival of the archive, the continuity of the institutions, the availability of resources, the political will to restore. And even when recovery occurs, it is often incomplete. The order that is restored is not identical to the order that existed before. It is a reconstruction, an approximation, a memory of what was. The later the recovery, the more fragmentary the memory. By the Neo-Assyrian period, the scribes who copied Sumerian texts were working in a language that was no longer spoken, using a script that had evolved significantly, preserving knowledge they may not have fully understood. The copying was an act of piety, a commitment to transmission, but it was also an acknowledgement of distance. The knowledge was old. The scribes were custodians of something they inherited but did not create, something they preserved but could not fully reconstruct. The knowledge was there, the knowledge was real, but the knowledge was also receding, fading, becoming harder to access. The Sumerian scribes, working at the height of the Ur-III state, or during the Old Babylonian period, were closer to the origin. But even they described themselves as restorers, as inheritors, as transmitters. They did not claim to be the source. They claimed to be the link. The chain extended back beyond them, beyond their teachers, beyond the texts they copied. The chain extended to the sages, to the time before the flood, to the gods. And the chain extended forward to the students they trained, the tablets they copied, the knowledge they passed on. The task was to keep the chain intact. Collapse was the breaking of the chain. Recovery was its restoration. But each break weakened the chain. Each recovery was a little less complete, and over millennia, the archive thinned. The knowledge became fragmentary, the memory became uncertain. What remained was not the whole of what had been, it was what could still be remembered. And what could still be remembered was this. There was an order. It existed before. It was given. It was transmitted. It collapsed. It was restored. It collapsed again. It was restored again. And each time the restoration was an attempt to return to what was before, to recover the pattern, to remember the way it was done. The knowledge was ancient. The knowledge was inherited. The knowledge was fragile. And the task always was to preserve it, to pass it forward, to resist the forgetting that was always encroaching. What the tablets allow us to ask is whether the last recovery we are part of, the recovery of the tablets themselves, the decipherment of the script, the reconstruction of Sumerian history, is also a restoration. Are we recovering something that was known before, something that was passed down and then forgotten, something that persisted in fragments, in traces, in the archive buried beneath the sand? Or are we discovering something new, reconstructing from ruins a past that no longer speaks, that exists only as artifact, as object, as evidence that must be interpreted without guidance from the tradition that created it? The tablets do not answer. They preserve the claim. This is what was known. This is what was done. This is what was transmitted. We receive the claim. We translate it. We interpret it. But we are not part of the chain. We are archaeologists of the chain, examining its links, tracing its path, mapping its breaks. We see the structure, but we do not inherit it. The knowledge we recover is different from the knowledge that was transmitted. It is mediated by time, by distance, by the loss of context. We have the tablets, but we do not have the teachers. We have the words, but we do not have the world in which those words were spoken, in which they were understood, in which they meant what they were meant to mean. What we have is the archive. And the archive says, this was preserved, this was remembered, this was passed forward. And the archive asks, what will you do with what we preserved? Will you continue the transmission? Or will the chain end here, with you, the last to read these words, the last to ask what they meant, the last to wonder where the knowledge came from, and whether it can still be remembered?